Well, Adam, it's never fun to have staff changes, right? I mean, like, as Mac Brown, I think, correctly says, you're affecting more than just the one person. You're affecting families. You're affecting the players who play under these different coaches. It's never a joyous thing. And yet, having said that, it just felt like Carolina needed to do something on the defensive side. And Coach Brown said it with me in the pregame before the bowl game. I'm sure he has said it in other places, that just Carolina's defense just has not been good enough. And I think Carolina's offense has been good enough for the most part. That's not to say that every moment of every game has been perfect. But I think on a more consistent basis, the Tar Heel offense has been good enough to the point that, like, Carolina could have been, like, top 10 in the country good enough. But it's been the defense that has held it down. And as Mac Brown says, those sometimes facts are negative, Adam, and that is factual, and it's also negative. So it just felt like Carolina needed to do something. And so Gene Chizik mutually parting ways, and I'm sure that was a difficult discussion. He and Mac Brown are legitimate personal friends. Their families are friends. They've coached together before. They've won at an extraordinarily high level before, together, individually. They respect each other a ton. And same with Tim Cross. He's worked with Coach Brown before. He was an original hire for Coach Brown when he came back to Carolina in 2019. Somebody that Coach Brown trusted and liked to coach that defensive line. But after a review this year, just Coach Brown deciding that something needed to happen, and I think it's hard to argue that something needed to happen. Ted Monachino, who had been working as an analyst on the defensive side. We talked to Coach Monachino before this past football season. Really accomplished defensive coach, is going to take over as the defensive line coach. Carolina will begin a national search for the defensive coordinator position. So it's not like I've got a note card with names on it to say, here's some guys the Tar Heels are going to talk to. But I think this is an important hire. It's going to be the third different defensive coordinator that Mac Brown has had just since being back in 2019. And, Adam, I think that says something. I don't know what it says, other than the Tar Heels hadn't been able to figure it out on that side of the ball good enough. And so I hope they find someone that can figure it out. And having said that, I think the Tar Heel defense is going to not just be good. It can't just be good enough to add with this terrific offense anymore, because Sam Howell and Drake May aren't here anymore. And that's not to say that Max Johnson or Connor Harrell isn't going to be awesome, but I just have a hard time believing that Carolina's offense can be as good as it has been, simply because you're not going to have at least somebody that we know right now is a first-round NFL draft pick like Drake May is surely going to be come this spring. So it's an important hire, and one that will certainly, I think, chart the course for the next couple of seasons for Carolina.
I think by virtue of our jobs, I think we're more likely than, I guess, quote-unquote media to think of these job changes as being really impactful to the entire family, because we do get to know some of these people on a little deeper level, and it's pretty rare that somebody is just such an irredeemable jerk that you're like, not only are they doing a terrible job, but I want them gone personally.
Right.
That just doesn't hardly ever happen. And that's not the case in this situation. Because I think both these individuals, I mean, remember when Tim Cross was hired, those first few days were heady because he was exactly what it felt like Tar Heel football needed.
Yep.
They needed that energy. And I think at that time they did. But just like with Gene Chizik, when you look at the product, it has not been good enough. And it has not enabled Carolina to win at the level that the program probably should have won at, given the assets it had on the offensive side. And so when that becomes true, you've got to try something different. And that's what Mack Brown's doing. And we don't know what that attempt will be. We'll find out before spring football. And I'll go ahead and tell you what's going to happen. The Tar Heels will hire a defensive coordinator, and everyone in the spring will say, this is working great. Everything is better. Probably shutouts at least 12, maybe 13 times this coming year. And it won't actually be like that. Don't freak out. Tar Heels are going to give up some points to Minnesota. But there has to be something different. There has to be. Anybody who watched the last month of the season knows that's the case. And Mack Brown knows that's the case. And that's why we're having this discussion. Feel bad for them personally. But Mack Brown, that's part of being a head coach.
Yeah.
You got to eventually do what you feel is best for the program. And it does feel like this is best for the program.
Just one final thing, and then we'll move on to our interview with Travis Stevenson. Whatever happened in that Virginia game seemed to be what turned it bad. Because then it just felt like the things that bothered Carolina against Virginia, who was not a good team and not a good offensive team, but they laid some kind of blueprint that other teams were able to follow. And stats aren't everything, but you cannot escape those stats of the second and fourth quarters against Georgia Tech, or the stats against Duke, who was playing with a third-string quarterback, or the fact that State scored on its first 8 possessions or whatever it was. Those are just inescapable facts. It seemed like tempo bothered Carolina. It seemed like the Tar Heels had trouble getting aligned the way they wanted against pre-snap motions and movements. And none of these things are like Carolina's not the only team, and these aren't like exotic ideas. But so that's all, and don't claim to be smart enough in football to say how Carolina can do it better. But that seems to be something that Carolina needs to do better from seeing what happened in the back half this year.
Who's the last Tar Heel defensive coordinator who you think you could get not universal agreement, but pretty good majority agreement that was a good defensive coordinator?
Carl Torbush after the reboot for the Tar Heels. But, dude, it also, again, and this is nothing disrespectful to Coach Torbush, he did have some incredible players out there. I mean, the late 90s Tar Heels defense was not just well run, it was with some really, really, really good players. And that's the thing. There have also been some moments of good defense since then. Gene Chizik's defense was pretty good in 2015. Wasn't great, but it was pretty good. Jay Bateman his defenses were pretty good. Actually, what am I talking about? I mean, Butch Davis, when he was here, Carolina, they had gotten very good defensively in the late 2000s, that 08, 09, and then, of course, we know everything crazy that happened in 2010. But under Everett Withers, they had gotten pretty good defensively there with Coach Davis, Butch Davis here. Of course, a very defensive-minded head coach.
So even that is over a decade ago.
Yeah.
That's a pretty long time.
Yeah, for consistency on the defensive side. Again, right. I think there have been seasons that have been better than others.
Right.
But for multiple years in a row, you're probably talking about the end of the Butch Davis era, right?
Which, as you said, not also a coincidence there. A lot of good players on those teams.
Yes. Yeah. So we'll see what happens. Carolina moving forward. And feels like a big offseason, certainly for Carolina football as it moves into 2024.